There are moments in history when time itself seems to fracture, when the world known in the morning becomes unrecognizable by nightfall, when the very air feels different, heavier, as though reality has shifted on its axis. November 22nd, 1963 was such a day. Margaret Ellen Hartley was there. She saw it happen, and even now, more than 60 years later, she can close her eyes and be transported back to Dealey Plaza, to the motorcade, to the moment when everything changed. Margaret, everyone called her Maggie back then, was 23 years old that autumn, a secretary at the Dallas Morning News, young and hopeful, and convinced that the world was getting better with each passing day. President Kennedy represented everything her generation believed in: youth, vigor, progress, the promise that America could be a force for good in the world. When word spread that he was coming to Dallas, the entire city seemed to hold its breath with anticipation. She remembered the morning of November 22nd with the kind of clarity that only trauma can etch into memory. The sky was a brilliant Texas blue, the kind of blue that makes a person grateful to be alive. There had been rain earlier in the week, but that Friday dawned clear and unseasonably warm. Margaret wore her best dress, a navy blue sheath with white piping that she had saved 3 months to buy, and her mother's pearl earrings. She wanted to look her best for the president. The office was electric that morning, though electric barely captured it. There was a kind of fevered excitement in the air, a giddiness that made it impossible to concentrate on work. Mr. Patterson, the editor, had given most of the staff permission to leave early to see the motorcade. "History is happening in our city," he said, his normally stern face creasing into a rare smile. "Go witness it." By 11 o'clock, Margaret was standing on the sidewalk along Main Street with her friend Dorothy, who worked in classified advertising. They had staked out their spot 2 hours early, right across from the old red courthouse, where they had a clear view of the route. The crowd around them grew denser with each passing minute. Businessmen in suits, mothers with small children perched on their shoulders, elderly couples holding hands, teenagers cutting school. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was talking about seeing the president and the first lady. "Do you think she'll wave at us?" Dorothy kept asking, her voice bright with excitement. She meant Mrs. Kennedy, of course. Jackie. Every woman in America wanted to be her, with her elegance and her fashion sense and her cultured voice. "I heard she's wearing pink, a pink suit with a matching pillbox hat." Margaret laughed at Dorothy's enthusiasm, though she felt it too. There was something almost magical about the idea of being so close to the President and First Lady, these figures who seemed larger than life, who represented everything beautiful and possible about America. In 1963, they still believed in Camelot. They still thought their leaders were heroes. The wait felt eternal. They stood there for what seemed like hours, shifting their weight from foot to foot, craning their necks to see down the street, listening for the first sounds of the motorcade. Around them, the crowd swelled and pressed closer. A vendor was selling miniature American flags for a quarter, and soon the air was filled with the snap and flutter of red, white, and blue. Children waved them enthusiastically, their faces flushed with excitement. "They're coming!" someone shouted, and the cry rippled through the crowd like a wave. "They're coming!" And then they saw them, or rather, they saw the motorcycles first. Dallas police officers in their crisp uniforms riding in formation, and then the lead car, and then the president's limousine, that beautiful dark blue Lincoln Continental convertible that would become the most famous and infamous car in American history. Margaret saw him. President Kennedy. He was so close she could have thrown a coin and hit the car. He was tanned and smiling, that famous Kennedy smile that could light up a room, and he was waving to the crowd on his side of the street. Mrs. Kennedy sat beside him, and Dorothy had been right. She was wearing pink, a pink Chanel suit with a matching pillbox hat, and she looked like something out of a dream, so beautiful and elegant that it almost hurt to look at her. "There they are," Dorothy was screaming, jumping up and down, waving her little flag. "There they are." Margaret waved too, both hands above her head, and for just a moment, just one perfect, frozen moment, the president looked right at her. His eyes met hers across that small distance, and he nodded, just slightly, still smiling. She felt her heart swell with something she could barely describe, pride, hope, joy, all mixed together into a feeling so intense it brought tears to her eyes. The motorcade moved slowly past them, and they turned to watch it go, following it with their eyes as it made the turn from Main Street onto Houston Street. The crowd was still cheering, still waving flags. Some people were already starting to disperse, satisfied with their glimpse of history. But Dorothy grabbed Margaret's arm. "Come on," she said, let's follow them to Dealey Plaza. We can see them turn onto the highway." Margaret hesitated. They were supposed to get back to work. But this was the President of the United States, and he was here in Dallas, in their city. When would they ever get another chance like this? "Okay," Margaret said, and they started half walking, half running down Houston Street, trying to keep the motorcade in sight. Other people had the same idea, and soon they were part of a small stream of citizens flowing toward Dealey Plaza, toward that green space in front of the Texas School Book Depository where the motorcade would make its final turn before heading onto Stemmons Freeway and out to the Trade Mart where the president was scheduled to give a luncheon speech. They reached Dealey Plaza just as the motorcade was making the turn from Houston onto Elm Street. It was 12:29 in the afternoon. Margaret looked at her watch, thinking she would need to remember exactly what time she saw the president pass by so she could tell her mother every detail later. She was always checking her watch in those days, always worried about being late, always conscious of time. How strange that she should look at her watch at that precise moment, as though some part of her knew that time itself was about to stop. The limousine moved slowly down Elm Street, slower than it had been moving before, or maybe it just seemed that way. The sun was brilliant overhead. The crowd was thinner here than it had been on Main Street, but people were still waving, still calling out. Margaret could see President Kennedy clearly now. He was on the right side of the car, closest to them, still waving, still smiling. Governor Connolly and his wife were in the jump seats in front of him. Mrs. Kennedy was on the president's left, and she was smiling too, her hand raised in that elegant wave she had. And then the world exploded. The first sound was sharp and sudden, a crack that echoed off the buildings around them. For a moment, for just a heartbeat, no one knew what it was. "A firecracker," someone said. "A motorcycle backfiring." But Margaret saw the president's hands move to his throat. She saw him lean forward slightly, his mouth opening, and she knew with a terrible certainty that came from somewhere deep and primal that something was terribly, horribly wrong. "What was that?" Dorothy said beside her, her voice uncertain. "Maggie, what—" The second shot cut her off, and the third. Margaret wanted to look away, but she couldn't. She saw it. She saw everything. The third shot hit the president in the head, and even from where she stood, perhaps 100 feet away, she could see the impact. She could see the terrible, unnatural way his head moved. She could see Mrs. Kennedy's pink suit suddenly splattered with red, so much red, impossibly red, against that perfect pink. The limousine, which had been moving so slowly, suddenly accelerated, its tires squealing. Mrs. Kennedy, Margaret would never forget this, never. Mrs. Kennedy climbed onto the back of the car. A Secret Service agent was running behind the car, and he jumped onto it, pushing her back into her seat. The car sped away, heading toward the triple underpass, and then it was gone, vanishing as though it had never been there at all. For a moment, there was absolute silence. The entire plaza seemed frozen, suspended in disbelief. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as though their minds refused to process what their eyes had just witnessed, as though reality itself had short-circuited. And then someone screamed. It was a woman's voice, high and terrible, a scream of pure anguish that seemed to release everyone else from their paralysis. Suddenly, people were running in every direction, some toward where the motorcade had been, some away from it, some just running without any destination. People were crying, shouting. A man near Margaret fell to his knees, his face in his hands. Children were wailing, not understanding what had happened, but sensing the terror of the adults around them. "Get down," someone was yelling. "Get down. There's a shooter." Dorothy grabbed Margaret's hand so hard it hurt. Her face was white, bloodless, her eyes wide with shock. "Maggie," she whispered. "Maggie, was that—" Margaret couldn't answer. She couldn't form words. Her mind kept replaying what she had seen, that terrible moment when the president's head had snapped back, when the pink suit had turned red, when everything that was bright and hopeful and good in the world had been extinguished in an instant. Police officers were running toward them, toward the grassy knoll, toward the school book depository. People were pointing in different directions, everyone certain they knew where the shots had come from. The air smelled like gunpowder and fear and the peculiar metallic scent of blood, though Margaret didn't know if she actually smelled blood or if her mind invented that detail later. "We have to go," Dorothy said, tugging at her hand. "Maggie, we have to get out of here." But Margaret couldn't move. She stood there in Dealey Plaza, in the bright November sunshine, with the taste of copper in her mouth, and her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. Around her the world was chaos, sirens wailing, people screaming, police shouting into radios. But she was trapped in that moment, watching it happen again and again in her mind's eye. The crack of the rifle, the president's hands at his throat, the terrible impact of that final shot. Mrs. Kennedy, in her blood-soaked pink suit, climbing onto the back of the car as though she could somehow escape what had just happened, as though movement alone could undo the horror. Eventually, Dorothy managed to pull her away. They stumbled back toward the office, moving like sleepwalkers through streets that had suddenly filled with people, all of them heading in the same direction, all of them drawn toward Dealey Plaza by some terrible magnetism. Radios were blaring from car windows and shop doorways, but the reports were confused, contradictory. The president had been shot. The president was wounded. The president was dead. No one knew for certain. No one wanted to believe it. Back at the Dallas Morning News, the office was in pandemonium. Reporters were shouting into phones, typewriters were clattering, and Mr. Patterson was standing in the middle of it all, his face gray, barking orders. Someone had set up a television in the corner, and a crowd had gathered around it, watching Walter Cronkite. Margaret didn't remember sitting down at her desk. She didn't remember Dorothy leaving her there. The next thing she knew, she was staring at her typewriter, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't have hit the keys if she had tried. Around her, the office continued its frenzied activity, but she sat in a pocket of stillness, unable to function, unable to think. At 1 p.m., Walter Cronkite came on the television with the official announcement. He took off his glasses, consulted his watch, and said the words that would be seared into the national consciousness. From Dallas, Texas, the flash apparently official. President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. The office went silent. Even the typewriters stopped. Someone let out a sob, a man's sob, deep and wrenching. Mr. Patterson, that stern, unflappable editor who never showed emotion, put his face in his hands and wept. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't feel anything at all in that moment. It was as though she had been hollowed out, as though the horror of what she had witnessed had burned away everything inside her, leaving only an empty shell. She sat at her desk until someone, she didn't remember who, told her to go home. She walked out of the office, down the stairs, out onto the street where people were gathered in small clusters, holding each other, crying openly. The city that had been so bright and excited that morning was now shrouded in grief. Shops had closed. Flags were already at half-staff. The streets, which had been packed with jubilant crowds just hours before, were now nearly empty except for small groups of stunned citizens who seemed unable to go home, unable to face the privacy of their own sorrow. Margaret walked home, a distance of perhaps 2 miles, in a daze. She passed the Adolphus Hotel, where just that morning she had seen people lining up for a glimpse of the president. She passed the church where her mother and she went to Mass every Sunday, and she could hear the bells tolling, that deep, mournful sound that marks death and disaster. She passed children playing in a yard, unaware that their world had just changed forever. When she finally reached her apartment, she unlocked the door, walked inside, closed it behind her, and stood in the middle of her living room, still wearing her navy blue dress with the white piping, still wearing her mother's pearl earrings. And then, finally, she collapsed. The days that followed existed in her memory as a blur of black and white, black crepe and white shock, black mourning and white grief. The television played constantly, showing the same images over and over: the motorcade, the hospital, the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson on Air Force One with Jackie Kennedy standing beside him in that blood-stained pink suit. Why hadn't she changed? Why hadn't someone given her something clean to wear? Years later, Margaret learned that Jackie had refused, saying, "Let them see what they've done." On Sunday, November 24th, Margaret watched on television as Lee Harvey Oswald, the man they said had killed the president, was himself shot and killed by Jack Ruby in the basement of the Dallas Police headquarters. She watched a man die on live television, and she felt nothing. She was beyond shock by then, beyond feeling. The world had become surreal, nightmarish, incomprehensible. On Monday, November 25th, they buried President Kennedy. Margaret watched the funeral on television. The riderless horse with the backwards boots in the stirrups, John F. Kennedy Jr.'s salute, Jackie Kennedy's veiled face. The whole world was watching. The whole world was mourning. But Margaret felt as though her grief was different, more immediate, more personal. She had been there. She had seen it happen. She had looked into the president's eyes just moments before he died. In the weeks and months that followed, Margaret tried to return to normal life. She went back to work. She went to church. She went through the motions of living. But something fundamental had broken inside her that day in Dealey Plaza. The world she had known, the world of hope and progress and bright futures, had died along with President Kennedy. In its place was a darker, more uncertain world, a world where violence could erupt at any moment, where heroes could be cut down in an instant, where nothing was safe or certain or permanent. She had nightmares for years. She would dream that she was back in Dealey Plaza, watching the motorcade approach, and she would try to scream, try to warn them, try to make the car stop or turn around. But in her dreams, as in life, she was helpless. She could only watch as history unfolded with its terrible inevitability. Margaret and Dorothy never talked about what they saw. They remained friends for a few more years, but there was a distance between them that had never been there before, a shared trauma that they couldn't acknowledge or discuss. Eventually, Dorothy moved to California, and they lost touch. Margaret often wondered if Dorothy still thought about that day, if she still saw it in her mind's eye the way she did. In 1965, Margaret left Dallas. She couldn't stay there anymore, couldn't walk past Dealey Plaza, couldn't live in a city where every street corner reminded her of that terrible day. She moved to Austin and started over, building a new life in a place that held no memories. She married eventually, had children, built a career. She lived a full life, a good life. But November 22nd, 1963 was always there, a shadow that never quite left her. People often asked her about conspiracy theories. Was it Oswald alone, or were there others? Was it the CIA, the Mafia, the Cubans, the Russians? She read the Warren Commission report. She read the books and watched the documentaries and listened to the endless debates, but she couldn't answer those questions. All she knew was what she saw, a young president full of life and promise, waving to a crowd on a beautiful November day. And then in the space of a few terrible seconds, he was gone. What she did know, what she learned that day, was how fragile everything is, how quickly the world can change, how the course of history can turn on a single moment, a single bullet, a single act of violence. People think they're safe. They think tomorrow will be like today. They make plans and dream dreams and believe that the future is theirs to shape. And then something happens. A shot rings out, a building falls, a virus spreads, and they realize how little control they actually have, how precarious their hold on normalcy really is. Margaret Ellen Hartley is 93 years old now. Most of the people who were in Dealey Plaza that day are gone. The witnesses are dying, one by one, taking their memories with them. Soon there will be no one left who was there, no one who saw it with their own eyes. The assassination will become pure history, studied in textbooks, analyzed in documentaries, but no longer living memory. But Margaret remembers. She remembers the brilliant blue of the sky. She remembers the snap of flags in the breeze. She remembers the excitement in Dorothy's voice when she saw Mrs. Kennedy's pink suit. She remembers the president's smile, the way his eyes met hers for just a moment. She remembers the sound of the shots, crack, 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 echoing off the buildings. She remembers the blood, so red against the pink. She remembers the scream that broke the silence. She remembers everything. Sometimes her grandchildren ask her about it. They have learned about JFK in school, seen the Zapruder film, read about the conspiracy theories. To them, it's history, as distant and abstract as the Civil War or World War I. But when they ask her what it was like, she struggles to find words. How does a person explain what it felt like to watch hope die? How does one convey the weight of witnessing a moment when everything changed? She tells them what she can. She tells them about the excitement of that morning, the way the whole city seemed to glow with anticipation. She tells them about standing on the street, waving her flag, seeing the president so close she could have touched the car. She tells them about the shots, though she spares them the worst details. And she tells them about what came after, the shock, the grief, the way the entire nation seemed to stop and weep. But what she really wants them to understand, what she desperately needs them to understand, is that history isn't just something that happens in textbooks. It's made up of moments, of individual human experiences, of ordinary people standing on ordinary street corners who suddenly find themselves in the middle of extraordinary, terrible events. Margaret was just a young secretary who wanted to see the president. She had no idea she would witness one of the darkest moments in American history. She had no idea that what she saw that day would haunt her for the rest of her life. November 22nd, 1963, Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas, 12:30 p.m. The day Camelot fell, the day innocence died, the day America lost something it would never quite recover. Margaret Ellen Hartley was there. She saw it. And now, more than 60 years later, she's still trying to make sense of it, still trying to understand how something so terrible could happen on such a beautiful day. They say time heals all wounds, but some wounds are too deep, too fundamental. Some moments are too seared into memory to ever truly fade. Margaret closes her eyes and she's 23 years old again, standing in the Dallas sunshine, waving at a president who will be dead in moments. She opens them and she's 93, an old woman at the end of her life, still carrying that terrible knowledge, still seeing that pink suit turn red. This is her testimony. This is her witness. This is what Margaret Ellen Hartley saw on the day President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. May God grant him peace. May God grant us all peace. And may we never forget what was lost that day in Dallas. Not just a president, but a piece of the national soul, a fragment of collective innocence that could never be recovered. The footage plays on, grainy and silent, in black and white archives. The motorcade moves through Dealey Plaza. The president waves. The shots ring out. The car speeds away. But behind those images, invisible to the camera, are the thousands of witnesses like Margaret, ordinary people whose lives were forever changed by what they saw. Their stories are the true historical record, the human cost of that terrible day that goes far beyond politics and conspiracy theories. Margaret sits in her living room now, an old woman surrounded by photographs of children and grandchildren, of a life well lived despite the shadow that has followed her. Outside her window, the world continues on, heedless and hurried, as it always does. But she carries November 22nd, 1963, within her still, not just as a memory, but as a wound that never quite healed, a moment frozen in time that defines everything that came after. She was there, she saw it happen, and she will carry that witness until her final breath, a living link to a day when history broke, when hope died in the Dallas sunshine, when the world learned once again how quickly everything can change. This is her story. This is her testimony. This is what it means to stand at the crossroads of history and watch as everything falls apart.